Night sat heavy on the battlements like a stone. Wind that had no business inside the castle found its way through arrow slits and half-shut windows, carrying with it a fine dust of frost that kissed the torchlight and made the shadows jitter. Torches guttered in iron sconces, their flames a tired line of gold against the high, damp walls. The great hall beyond the servant corridors hummed with a warm, dangerous light, laughter, clinking cups, the measured footfalls of those who had names carved into the very bones of the place. Down below, in the narrow artery of the servant halls, another sound answered the night, the soft, almost apologetic scrape of a broom. Ilara moved like a ghost who had learned the shape of silence. Her skirts were patched where winter had gnawed at hem and seam. Her hands were raw from scrubbing hearthstones that never seemed to remember sunlight. She kept to the corners and the lower steps, the spaces the nobility never noticed. The castle had routines, bells, calls, and the king's temper, but for Ilara the only constant was absence. She'd been 14 when the war took her parents, 14 winters of counting out a life from the crumbs left behind. No one asked where she'd come from or whom she belonged to now. That anonymity was both refuge and wound. A stray laugh from the servants' quarters rose and fell like a bird startled from a ledge. Ilara tightened her grip on the broom and let it pass. She watched other hands, calloused, soft, gilded, lift and set down plates, wrap ribbons for traveling ladies, shovel coal into a furnace that never cooled. The world of those hands was full of gestures that meant belonging. A familiar nickname, a parcel left at a bedside, a smile that did not look away. She had learned to read what belonged to others and to make her own small possessions invisible. A dented tin for coins, a scrap of wool with her mother's hem sewn into the inside, the echo of a lullaby that came back in the small hours. Between two doorways, an iron-studded door breathed its cold draft. It was the older wing of the castle, the one servants passed with lowered eyes and quick steps. Rumors braided through the corridors about what lay behind it, madmen, relics, curses spoken in the old tongue. When children dared each other to touch its bolts, the elders would clap hands and whisper of broken promises. Ilara paused by the door tonight, feeling the chill drift through the cracks like something that remembered other winters. There was a sound from within that was not wind, a rhythm, faint and patient, like someone practicing the length of silence. She did not open the door. Her life had been a lesson in the cost of curiosity. Yet as she leaned her broom against the cold stone and watched the smoke bones of the torches shiver, she realized that grief had a way of hollowing the space inside you until things leaned close. Rumor, shadow, possibility. She straightened, smoothed her skirts, and moved on invisible as ever, but with the shape of that patient rhythm folded under her ribs. The castle breathed around her, full of secrets waiting like winter seeds, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Ilara felt the prickle of something that might, one day, make the dark answer back. Dawn arrived in the castle in stages. The first thin blue light that sifted through arrow slits, the slow swing of the great bell that shook sleep from the rafters, and then the sudden, practical bustle of those whose lives were measured by work rather than title. Ilara learned the castle's rhythms not as a choice, but as a law. She woke before the other servants, fingers numb from the cold, and traced the familiar map of tasks with the kind of attention that made the day tolerable. Sweep, scald, mend, carry. Each motion was a small, precise prayer against chaos. Her mistress, Lady Voss, held to cruelty like a second skin. The woman's accent clipped words into punishments. A mislaid towel could be called a betrayal, and a slow-combed hair was evidence of sloth. Lady Voss loved to see people straighten their backs under her gaze, to measure the worth of a person in the angled lines of their apology. Once, when Ilara accidentally broke a crystal from the Lord's study, a small, commonplace thing that had been left on the ledge, Lady Voss summoned her with nails tapping like a metronome. "You will learn the cost of carelessness," she said, and the words wrapped around Ilara like a cold cloak. The punishment that followed was not loud. Extra polishings, an unending stack of linens until her fingers ached and made fine white crescents under her nails. Humiliation settled into her bones, slow and patient. The nobles were a different kind of cruelty. At banquets, they wore laughter like jewelry and tossed crumbs of compassion down to the servants as though alms. Some of the young men would point at Alara as she passed and pretend she were invisible. Others would invent nicknames that made her small. There were nights when her cheeks burned from imagined affronts, when a careless word from a lord felt like a sword. She learned to carry these slashes like talismans, turning them inward until they hardened into a kind of armor. But armor weighs. It hunched her shoulders, made the world seem shorter. Chores multiplied with the seasons. Winter demanded more fuel, more scouring of soot from hearth frames. Summer asked nothing of her but vigilance against flies and the endless polishing that made the halls glitter for guests who never noticed her work. The servants who shared her corridors had their own trials, old jealousies, debts, small triumphant alliances. But Alara found that companionship was often a treaty with distance. They laughed together over charred bread and swapped gossip like talismans, but they also kept the parts of themselves that hurt most carefully folded. Grief taught her to hold things alone. Her yearning was a secret the castle could not name. It started as a soft ache at the base of her throat, an ache that pressed like a hand to a wound and would not be soothed by bread or sleep. Alara would steal quiet moments, standing by the arrow slit in the laundry room and letting her eyes travel beyond the gray stones to the dark line of trees, to the sky that looked as if it belonged to another life. In those stolen breaths, she imagined other days, a field that had not been trampled by armor, a voice that hummed beside her while the sun set without fear. These imaginings felt like contraband. She kept them like matches in her pocket, small flashes that warmed her for a second before they went out. If the castle had a heart, it was in the older wing, the part with the iron-studded door and the whispering draft. Servants avoided it as much from habit as from fear. When children were small enough to believe in monsters, they would press their palms to its bolts and dare each other to run a finger over the cold metal. The elders would hiss and tell stories in curtained kitchens about why it was sealed. A plague, a betrayal, a pious sin turned into a curse. Names drifted through those tailies, an Osgard who stole a thing he should not have, a priestess who sealed bargains with blood, but the versions differed with each retelling. The truth, as with most things in the castle, lay tangled beneath layers of necessity and the king's needs. Tonight, she learned, a page had been found hovering near the door. A scrap of vellum with a map drawn in a hand Alara did not recognize. Someone had tried to hide it under a pile of coal sacks, but gossip is a living thing and had eaten the secret quickly. The map did not show treasure or roots. It showed rooms that were erased from the newer plans of the castle, cellars that did not exist on the official blueprints, a spiral stair that led to a blank square marked only with a circle and a single word in the old tongue. The servants passed the scrap from hand to hand like a forbidden loaf, eyes bright with what might be danger and might be salvation. Alara watched the exchange from across the hearth, fingers absently threading a strip of wool. A tiny, traitorous thrill prickled her skin. The rumors of the wing had always been a half-closed door in her mind. Now, with that scrap of vellum, the shape behind it seemed to inhale and become larger. She folded her hands, tamped down the ember of curiosity with the practiced restraint of someone who had learned the cost of daring. Yet even as she smoothed the cloth and returned to her work, the notion of a locked place, of a secret held in stone and silence, sat beneath her ribs like a second heart. It beat, patient and insistent, and in the cadence of its thud she heard, faint and certain, the promise of change. The scrap of vellum had been a coal-black ember in the day. At dusk it became tinder. Alara found herself tracing the crooked line of the map with a fingertip while everyone else readied the great hall for supper. The candle she carried, a stub with more smoke than light, trembled as if the wick felt the same curiosity that had woken under her ribs. She followed the directions the map suggested with a servant's stealth. Past the linen closets whose door hinges sighed like old men, down a flight of steps that smelled of damp straw, and along corridors where the torches were fewer and their flames thinner. The iron-studded door loomed before her like a promise she had no right to claim. Up close, the metal was colder than the air, the studs hammered in an old, irregular pattern that suggested the work of a forgotten smith. The lock was vast, a great iron eye that had not been tended in years. It wore green veins of rust and a crust of age. Somewhere deep inside the castle, a bell told the hour, a sound that felt like a reprimand. Ilara's pulse stroked at the base of her throat, and she remembered, absurdly, the lullaby her mother had hummed while mending shirts, a melody that had nothing to do with locked doors, and yet everything to do with keeping fear at bay. A stray gust pushed its way from beneath the door, carrying with it a scent that made Ilara's stomach tighten. Damp earth, old iron, and something sweeter beneath, like dried roses kept too long in a chest. She held the candle higher. The flame licked at the lock and did not want to die. For a moment, she thought she heard another sound beneath the sigh of the stone. A soft, patient rhythm, like someone keeping time with a hand against their own ribs. It was the sound she'd felt that night on the battlements, only closer. It made the world tilt. She could not tell whether she had expected to see a shadow, a face, a thing with teeth, or merely the emptiness of rumor. Fear had taught her a vocabulary of retreat. The memory of a man's hanger flattened into a belt when her father had come home drunk, the sudden silence of neighbors taken in the night. But curiosity, that small, stubborn iron that sat beneath grief, had taught her another language. The names of thresholds, the precise way a candle bell chimed when you held it too close to the cold. Ilara crouched and pressed her ear to the door's iron ribs. The sound on the other side slid through like liquid, a whispering that was not words so much as histories, a susurrus made of sighs and counted breaths. She put her eye to the keyhole. The sight that met her was mostly darkness, a darkness that seemed to be gathered like a cloak. Yet from its edges, the faintest suggestion of movement answered her, not the clumsy, human twitch of a sleeping person, but a patient, deliberate stir as if something had been measuring the hours and found them wanting. A pale gleam caught the keyhole's rim, a shudder of something that might have been an eyelid, or the catching of moonlight on a polished surface. Then, as if delimiting caution from invitation, a whisper slipped through, two syllables that were almost a name and almost a warning. "ELA," it breathed. The sound was wrong. It was not the castle's voice, nor any of the servants, but it tugged at the string of her mother's lullaby for reasons she could not explain. Her hands went cold. The candle threatened to gutter. She cupped it with 2 fingers and felt the heat like a pulse. For a breath, she thought she might speak back, say nothing more than "Who's there?" and then apologize for the trespass. The thought of asking permission felt absurd. The door did not belong to the world of courtesy. A rat scurried somewhere within the walls. It was a small, mortal clatter that might have been a chorus intended to prove the world was still ordinary. Ilara straightened. The map felt suddenly heavy in her hand, raw as a piece of flesh. She retreated 2 steps, then 3, the candle light making her shadow on the stone like a second person who moved with more confidence than she had. Her feet found the path back by habit. She kept her head low, the way one does when carrying bad news. The rush of the servants' passage greeted her as if she had never been gone, a bar of warmth, a clatter of spoons. She slid into that noise and let it swallow the door behind her. That night she could not sleep. The castle's sounds became a chorus of questions. The far laugh of a nobleman, the soft weeping of a child somewhere deep in the servant quarters, the slow, repeating creak of the rafters. Each noise mapped onto the image locked in her mind. The iron-studded door, the whisper that had said, impossibly, a fragment of her name. Her chest felt crowded with small, indistinct things. The memory of her mother's touch, the taste of bread eaten standing up, the way grief had hollowed rooms inside her until other noises could fit. By the time the bell called the second watch, Ilara found herself moving again. She told herself it was the need to confirm her fear, to banish the image with the ordinary act of proving it empty. She patted the corridor barefoot, the soles of her feet cold and obedient. The candle this time was smaller, borrowed from a kitchen sconce where a cook had been too busy to notice its absence. The flame threw a paler light, and the iron-studded door looked even more immense, like a face with its jaw clenched. She laid a palm on the metal and, absurdly, trembling with something that felt equal parts terror and longing, pressed her ear to its center. The whispering met her again, and this time there was a rhythm beneath it, patient and regular, like the steady, slow beat of something that had been waiting long enough to be ancient. She should have fled. She knew the rules. Do not open what is sealed, do not draw attention, do not trade peace for stories. Her feet wanted to move, but her hands would not let go of the iron. The voice, or whatever had used it, brushed the inside of her name and left a residue that made the skin along her collarbone rise. Ilara stepped back with a breath that felt like a winter wind. She fled then, not with the clattering of panicked feet, but with the precise, careful movement of one who had learned to survive by shrinking. Still, as she reached the bend where the corridor swallowed sight, the iron note of the door behind her seemed to echo in her chest, and beneath it, like a pledge or a wound, the patient rhythm beat on. She walked away because she must, because the world expected her to, but the map in her pocket pressed like a promise. Even as she smoothed her hands and returned to the hearth, the door's silence threaded itself through her sleep and dreams until curiosity and dread braided into something she could not ignore. The corridor that led to the older wing remembered every tread that had ever pressed its flagstones. Ilara moved along it with the low certainty of someone rehearsing a prayer, one foot in front of the other, hands kept close to her skirts, breath measured like the timing of a bell. The map in her pocket had grown warm from night and curiosity. The lines on the vellum had the blunt confidence of handwriting that belonged to people who kept secrets for a living. She had told herself, on the way down, that she would come only once. That proof was the only thing she needed, and that a single glance would settle the restless thing under her ribs. But promise is a fragile armor. Promises break in the dark the way torches gutter. The door loomed like a jaw. Ilara dug a rusted nail from the hem of her skirt, a poor locksmith perhaps, but then so was she, and found the lock cheaper than fear. It yielded with a groan that felt like the clearing of an old throat. The hinge sighed as it opened, and cold spilled out like an animal. For a moment the world narrowed to the thin cone of candlelight and the breath she could see puffing in the dank air. Beyond the threshold, the air tasted of iron and dried leaves. A spiral of steps dropped away into a well of black that a single candle could not conquer. Ilara descended with the practiced caution of someone who knew how to make herself small. The stones drank her quiet as if they had been waiting for footsteps. When the stair opened into the chamber, her breath hitched at the sight. The cell was not as the nursery tailies had described. It was not a place of crude bones or bare chains for some petty criminal. It was a structure of intention. Iron bars ringed a central pit, and within that pit lay a body wrapped in darkness. Chains of a black metal, the kind that spoke of masterful forging and spells layered beneath the iron, bound wrists to stone. Symbols were hammered into each link, small stars and scratches like secret prayers. The air hummed with a sound that was not wind, a low resonance under the ribcage of the castle that made Ilara's teeth feel loose. He turned as she stepped into the light, not with the startling speed of myth, but with the economical motion of someone who was measuring himself against surprise. Dorian looked older than the soldier's tailies suggested, and younger in a way that made no sense. The face was clean-cut, a map of small scars that suggested both battles and a life kept careful. His cheekbones were high as if sculpted, and his hair had the moonlight's color, the silvered kind that belonged to the sea and storm. Yet it was his eyes that held her, not the blank, glittering hunger the nursery stories promised, but a fire dimmed to ember. Grief had settled there like ash. When he met her gaze, it was as if he had been tracing the edge of his name for so long he had forgotten its sound. For a second, fear came to her like rain. The stories in the kitchens spoke of immortals who could bend a man's will with a look, who moved faster than shadow and whose lips tasted of winter. This man was those stories and also not. He was smaller inside the bindings than the tailies had allowed for. The metal had not simply held him, it had taught him the shape of waiting. His limbs were drawn in, as though the chain had stitched itself into more than muscle. It had taken a decade and left its mark in posture, in the slow, careful way he breathed. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice surprised her. It was not the growl of beasts nor the velvet of villains. It held layers, like pages pressed together. It held a weariness that belonged to long roads and older regrets. Ilara felt the candle in her hand shake. She had rehearsed nothing. The map, the scrap of vellum, the whisper of her name at the keyhole all felt small compared to the person in front of her. "Who are you?" He tilted his head, as if the question pleased him and then betrayed him. "Dorian," he said simply. The name seemed to fall like a stone in the chamber and make sound that reached distant places inside him. "And you are trouble, tiny bleeding light. Why do you trespass?" "Because," she felt the answer gather in her like a refusal. "Because you said my name," she wanted to say. "Because I have a map. Because I am tired of scraping bowls and not being remembered. Because the world smells of iron and longing and I could not bear it any longer." Instead, she lifted her chin as best as she could and said, "Because I was curious." He watched her, that ember in his eyes flaring with something like interest and then dimming. "Curiosity for the living can be lethal where I have learned to survive, Alara. I have been chained for a decade by a king who fears anything that will not kneel. He bound me with more than iron. He bound me with law and the people's stories. He thinks that fear becomes the same as safety." The name of the king made a small avalanche in Alara's memory. The carved face at the high table, a voice like weather. She did not know how to answer. Dorian's hand flexed against the chain. It made a sound like a dry bell. "Do not call me monster if you can help it," he said softly. "There are rooms in me you have not seen. There are things I regret and things I would never do." As she looked into his eyes, Alara felt something like the first thaw after a long frost. The candle between them threw their shadows along the wall in long, uncertain shapes, and for the first time since the war had taken her family, she felt the world hold more than the weight of survival. She felt there was a history in the chamber that wanted witness. He slept when she left, asleep like a veiled promise, and she stepped back into the stairwell with her heart beating as though she had run. Behind her, the chains sang softly, a sound that would lay under her thoughts like a seed. She walked away because she had to, but her feet remembered the timbre of his voice and the slow ember in his gaze. It followed her through the corridor until the clatter of the kitchen swallowed her whole, and for the first time, curiosity did not taste like shame. It tasted, faintly, like salvation. Alara returned 2 nights later with a bundle of stolen comforts, an old woolen wrap, a wedge of bread, a tin cup scoured bright enough to be useful. Fear had its own memory, and she moved through it like a practiced dancer, avoiding creaks and the known places where servants paused to gossip. The stairwell smelled of wet stone and iron. The candle she carried threw the world into soft relief, making the shadows seem more considerate than they actually were. When she pushed open the cell door, Dorian was awake. He had taken to sitting with his back against the stones, shoulders folded in as though each breath required counting. The chains had slackened only a little. The king's smith and the king's priests had ensured that, but they no longer looked like the sole architecture of his existence. In the candlelight, his skin was the color of river clay after rain, and his eyes, those embers, caught the flame as if in private devotion. "You bring offerings," he observed without surprise. There was a wryness in the corner of his mouth, an old amusement as if she had delivered a predictable, pleasing ritual. Alara set the food down with hands that trembled less than when she had crossed the threshold. "You look like you could use warmth," she said simply. Saying it made her voice steadier than she felt. "And bread." She had little else to barter with, scraps of kindness and the small courage of returning. He accepted the cup, turning it over in his hands with a gentle, almost reverent motion. "Items matter less than the movement behind them," he said. "Most leave cloth and coin. Few leave themselves." There was an accusation in it, soft-edged, like frost that cuts only if you press long enough. Alara watched him eat, that small, intimate act, and found herself surprised at her own calm. In the kitchens, people ate to fill a hole. Here it looked like an argument with hunger itself. "Why are you chained?" she asked, because the map had told her where to go but not how to answer the things she'd find. Dorian's jaw worked. He traced a pattern on the stone with the tip of a finger. "Kings make stories to keep their crowns steady," he said. "They tell of monsters to keep men in their places. I am a useful story. Once, perhaps, I was more useful alive than bound. Once, I had choices that did not include rust and sleep. Betrayal is the currency of thrones. Some betray openly with sword and law. Others betray with promises that sound like love. I was betrayed by both." His voice held no self-pity. It was a catalog of facts laid out like trade goods. Yet beneath the facts thrummed something else, a loneliness so palpable it softened the edges of the chamber. "Do you hate him?" Alara asked, meaning the king but meaning more. The idea that had bound Dorian's life into a loop of restraint. "Hatred is heavy," Dorian said. "It anchors you to the shore. I was taught to weigh my anger and then to bury the weight. Not because I forgive easily, do not mistake me, but because I have lived long enough to see what hatred does to those who carry it. It hardens you, it eats choices." He turned his eyes to hers with a frankness that was startling. "What I fear is not him, it is becoming the cruel story he tells about me." Alara's reply was a whisper. "Were you dangerous before they bound you?" He smiled, and it was small and sharp, like the edge of a remembered blade. "Dangerous and lonely are cousins. I could break a body or break a heart. I could move through a room and unsettle the air. But my most devastating skill was staying. I could watch centuries fold and remember the names of those few who mattered. That becomes its own torture." He glanced at the chains with an intimacy that made her think of lullabies and long vigils. "If you had to carry a person's life like a ledger, could you keep only the good entries?" Her chest tightened. The question landed in her like a stone in a pond, sending ripples through memories she had kept too neat. Her mother's laugh, the flames that had taken their home, the silence that followed. She had kept the good entries because grief had no mercy for clutter. Alara felt the impulse to protect him, an impulse that confused and alarmed her. "You are not the stories," she said, more firmly than the thought had intended. "Stories are for keeping people safe. They make it easier to sleep, but they are not the same as people." Her words surprised them both. She had not known she had so much conviction until she heard it. Dorian's look held something like relief, then interest, a reigniting ember in his gaze. "Tiny bleeding light," he murmured, using the nickname he'd bestowed the first night. "You are an odd sort of mercy." He shifted his chained hand until it lay against the stone. "Tell me of the life outside these walls. Tell me of grass and seasons. Tell me something human." She spoke, halting at first, and then with the steadiness of someone pouring seed into a furrow. She described a river that had once sung by her childhood house, a field of thistles her father had cursed, the way the market smelled on fair days. As she spoke, Dorian listened with the kind of attention that consumes and preserves. When she finished, she found that her fear had softened into a curious tenderness, and in the warmth of that small intimacy, the chamber seemed to widen just a little. "You make loneliness sound like a place with a shape," she said, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. "How do you live in it?" He did not answer at once. Instead, he reached only as far as the chain allowed and laid his palm, flat and still, on the floor between them. "By collecting small things," he said. "A scrap of a laugh, a remembered taste, the cadence of names. By letting someone else's curiosity be a lantern in the dark." His gaze met hers, steady and unembarrassed. "You are a dangerous thing to bring to a man who has been taught to survive alone, Alara." She laughed, a small sound that had equal parts fear and defiance. "And you are dangerous to a servant who has been taught to look away." They held each other's silence for a long moment, two people on either side of an abyss, neither sure if the bridge between them was strong enough. Outside, the castle breathed and shifted, unaware. Inside, a different sort of thaw had begun. Alara's visits became a quiet arithmetic. One step past the linen closet, two past the brazier, a pause at the kitchen's shadow where coin and compassion were counted differently. She learned where the cook kept the dreg bread, and which chambermaid saved a bit of cold stew under a ladle. She learned how to take warmth without calling it theft, how to fold a borrowed wool into a neat square that smelled lightly of rosemary and kitchens, how to slip a tin cup into the hollow of her skirts so it made no sound against stone. Each small thing she smuggled into the dark was a promise in a language she had only lately begun to speak. Dorian's gratitude was never loud. When she pushed the door open and held the candle steady, he would give the slightest lift of his chin, a gesture like a benediction. He took water as if it were a rare wine, and the cloth she brought made the roughness of the chains less urgent against his skin. When she set scraps of bread down for him, he would break them with hands that trembled only the slightest, and eat as if learning the manners of a world that had once known pleasure. "You see small things as folding into larger ones," he said one night, fingers blue against the tin. You remind the dark to be useful. Alara laughed because it felt easier than naming what she had felt, the thudding of a heart that had not known it could pay attention. You make the same meal sound like a poem, she answered. I learned the shapes of stew so I might not be surprised. I also learned how to carry things that are best hidden. Her voice warmed in the hush of the chamber. I bring what I can. They began to trade stories the way people trade bread. Short and then longer, a crust for a crumb until the appetite grows. At first they were safe things, names of lanes, the scent of particular soap, how the market hawker called for buyers on midweek. Then, like the first break in winter's hold, the histories unfolded. Alara spoke of the war in small, precise strokes, as if careful phrasing could keep the edges from bleeding. She told him of a high summer morning when the village green had been full of music, and of armor arriving like thunder. She spoke of the night flames took their roof and left the sky bright with small suns, and of how her parents had been folded into unmarked graves while the world continued to billow with smoke. Her voice held no accusation. It was the telling of facts, the articulation of pain into something that could be held and moved. Dorian listened with a patience that felt like water pooling into a dry cup. When she finished, he did not offer a platitude or a sermon. Instead, he offered memory, the kind that is shaped by exile rather than hunger. I remember a city with glass like water, he said, speaking slowly as if dredging a deep place. I remember a woman who taught me to read the constellations as one might read a face. I remember promises made in the dark that outlived the people who spoke them. He paused, and his gaze slipped to the chains again as if to remind himself of the present. I have been out of sunlight longer than your life, Alara. I have watched centuries stack like fallen books. I have loved and lost in measures that are hard to hold without becoming brittle. There was a hunger in his confession that was not the crude appetite the kitchen staff gossiped about. It was a hunger for witness, for a name repeated so often it would not dissolve. Alara found that she wanted to be that name. She wanted to be the one who could hold his past without flinching. Her own history, small and jagged though it was, felt suddenly like a bridge between their two worlds. You are not brittle, she told him once, astonished at the steadiness in her own voice. You have cracks, yes, so does a bowl that has been well used, but that is not weakness. It is the proof of use. Dorian's smile that night was almost tender, a small curve that shifted the shadow on his face. You are generous with your metaphors for someone who scrubs plates for a living. And you are unexpectedly poetic for an immortal, she shot back, then softened. You are also not as alone as you might pretend. They developed rituals. She would fold the wool just so and lay it at his shoulder. He would hum fragments of songs she had never heard, scraps of melodies that seemed older than the stone. Once he traced the edge of a scar at his temple and told her the name of the battle where it was earned. Another night he taught her to feel the exact pitch of iron when a chain was too taut and would chafe. Those sounds and small teachings accumulated between them like the coins in a hidden jar, private, significant, and the basis of slow trust. But the castle kept its own ledger. The books that recorded who came and went did not notice the soft economy of bread and cloth exchanged below ground. But eyes that moved through corridors like knives began to see patterns. A chambermaid was seen whispering too often with a boy who had been seen near the older wing. A cook muttered about a missing tin that had not in fact been taken to the common pit. Steward Hest, a small, efficient man whose payroll kept the kingdom's servants in the expected order, made a note when a mop and bucket were left out of their place for the second night running. We cannot have folk wandering, Lady Voss said one morning at the head of a linen pile, not loudly, but with a clarity that carried. Order is what keeps these rafters from collapsing into chaos. Her glance slid like a blade across the sewing table. Someone has been shirking duties. Find them. Rumor moved with the speed of dry kindling. By the time Alara realized the shadow of suspicion had crept to the kitchens, it had the edges of a noose. She had been careful, always careful, but care cannot make a body invisible when others are looking for reasons to point. The little rituals she and Dorian had constructed felt suddenly loud in the hush of the servant halls. One evening, coming back from the chamber with a folded wool tucked inside her skirts, Alara paused where two corridors met. There, leaning against the cold stone like a question, stood a young guard she recognized, Merrick, a sentry who paced the outer walls. He did not glance at her with the casual cruelty some nobles displayed. His eyes were sharper, the kind that noticed the details of footprints. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then Merrick's lips moved. "You've been in the old wing," he said without preamble. Alara's fingers clenched around the wool. Her mouth found silence like a refuge, but the lie she had quickly learned to tell, about mending a broken bucket, about fetching a pot, stayed brittle at the edge of her tongue. Merrick did not step forward. He folded his arms and looked past her, toward the iron-studded door that lay like a sealed wound at the corridor's end. "There's talk," he said. "Things that do not fit the ledger. The steward's been noting missing things. If you're found where you shouldn't be..." He let the sentence hang, a blade with the weight of consequence. Alara swallowed. The chamber where Dorian waited was small and held as much of her life as any other room she had known. To lose it now would be to have the only place where she felt seen erased by the very order that kept her alive. She folded her shoulders in a habit of self-protection, mind skimming with plans too thin to be solid. "I'm careful," she said finally, and the word sounded like a promise and like an apology at once. Merrick's face was unreadable in the torchlight. "Then be more careful," he said, and stepped away, the scrape of his boot a slow, deliberate sound. As he left, the corridor seemed to sag with the new knowledge. The wool in her hands felt suddenly heavier. She pressed it to her chest, and for the first time since she had begun to bring bits of warmth to the chamber, fear threaded its way through the tender fabric of trust. The secret they had been building was now a thing with edges that could cut, and the castle's long, measured appetite for order had sharpened its teeth. The scrap of vellum had become a map of hunger. It sat between Alara's fingers in the dimness of the chamber like something alive. The lines that had once been inked by an unknown hand now felt like a route she had been apprenticed to walk. She had come with the wool and the bread and a small iron nail to ease the lock, little tools for little crimes. But tonight the chamber smelled different. Not the usual mix of iron and old leaves, but a taut scent like a drawn bow. The castle itself seemed to hold its breath. Dorian lay propped against the stone, the chain that bound him rattling with the slow rhythm of his life. His eyes lifted when she entered, not with surprise, but with the weary courtesy of a man who had learned to measure his needs against the world's capacity to grant them. "You bring storms now," he said, and there was a humor so thin it might be mistaken for wind. Alara did not answer with words. She set the wool down, placed the bread in reach, then drew the small iron nail from her palm and knelt by the closest ring. The metal of the chain was cold and inscrutable. Runes had been hammered along its length in a script that did not belong to any kitchen or scribe she had seen. Dorian watched her with an attentiveness that made the space between them smaller and therefore more dangerous. "You know what you do," he said softly. She met his gaze. "I know what they say," she answered. "But what they say are stories dressed in armor. They made you into a reason to be afraid. Not because you hurt them, but because you would not be easily ruled." The truth sat in the room like a second torch. "The king bound you to teach the people how to be obedient. He made you a monster for convenience." At the name of the king, Dorian's muscles tightened. The chain tore a sound like old wood snapping. "Convenience keeps crowns," he said, "but crowns also invite weight. I do not ask you to be naive, Alara. There are parts of me that can be terrible, generous only to their own ends. I have been made to look like the worst of many ages." Her hand did not shake when she touched the link. Perhaps grief had stolen the small tremors of fear from her. Perhaps courage grows where there is nothing left to lose. She thought of her parents folded into the unmarked graves, of the world that had taken them while men argued over where their banners should fall. She thought of the way Dorian had said her name the first night, not as rumor but as a keening, and felt, absurdly and utterly, that the world had given her one more thing to bear. "Then tell me how to not become cruel," she said. "Tell me how to keep you from becoming what they say." Dorian's laugh was brief and near broken. "Would you command the sea to be kinder?" he asked. "I am tides and weather, Alara. My nature is more complicated than a ledger." She pressed the nail into the seam where rune met iron. The metal hummed under her touch, a low vibration that walked up her arm and settled behind her teeth. There were things about the chains that felt old as bone and clever as a trap. The runes were not decoration. They were law, hammered into the metal by a smith who understood more than the temper of steel, by a priest who understood the temper of belief. The king had not only hammered iron, he had hammered fear into a shape that the kingdom could repeat at will. Illyra bent to the lock and murmured something that surprised her. A fragment of the lullaby her mother had hummed when mending shirts, a lullaby that had been more prayer than song. The melody was not a key, she knew, but memory moves in strange economies. The tune trembled in the stone and seemed to make the runes shiver like fish in a net. Dorian watched, an unreadable expression on his face, as if he were seeing her through a new lens. When the nail gave, it was not with a satisfying clang, but with a sound like a hinge releasing after years of disuse. The chain flexed. For a single, terrible breath, the world felt like a thing balanced on exactness. If she stopped now, if she retreated with knowledge and without action, the story would roll on. If she continued, then she would have to answer whatever woke. Her palm slid along the chain and found another ring, and then another. Each link yielded in the order she chose, as if the metal itself considered her intention. At last, she reached the link that held Dorian's wrist to the stone. The rune there was the deepest of them all, carved around the iron as if to keep something in or to keep something out. Her nail caught the edge, and for a moment it would not budge. The lullaby thinned into a single note. Dorian's hand, bound and veined, tightened as if to brace for release. "Illyra," he said, and his voice carried a warning that was also a benediction. "If you do this, know what it will cost." She looked at him, really looked, seeing the fine lines at the corner of his eyes, the way his fingers curled as if remembering a glove they had not worn in long years. "I know," she said. "I choose the cost." The final twist of metal broke with the sound of rain starting on lead. The chain fell away from his wrist like a wolf shedding winter, and the room inhaled. For a heartbeat, everything was ordinary. The candle flame, the smell of stale bread, the small skitter of dust motes caught in the torchlight. Then the castle answered. Air moved as if something vast had turned in sleep. The light from the candle elongated and went blunt, as if an eclipse brushed it. The runes on the fallen chains flared with an inner phosphorescence that painted the walls with a map of stars. The sound that rose was an undertone that a jaw could feel more than an ear. It was the old music of the earth waking and the thin, high song of something reassembling itself. Dorian's body changed with a logic Illyra felt in her bones. The color of his skin shifted from river clay to a tone without name, as if moonlight had been poured through him. His exhale came deep and startling, a release that blew hair from his brow and sent a chill across Illyra's knuckles. For a moment he made a sound that was not human, a long, low thing like a bell in a cave. It vibrated through the stones and drew a small answering echo from the broken runes. Fear rose like sea under her ribs, sharp and immediate. She took an involuntary step back, but Dorian's freed hand, the one that had been bound, reached without haste. He touched the back of her wrist with a gentleness that made the hair along her arms lift. "I am not the first thing to break free," he murmured. "I have been unmade by fear and made again by duty. I could be worse than the stories. I could be kinder. You have given me an impossible measure." His voice held neither triumph nor the predator's hunger that rumor promised. There was an ache there that was almost a prayer. Around them, the runes cooled into dull metal, and the chains lay inert as if they had been emptied of purpose. For a breath, for the breadth of a long life condensed to a single choice, Illyra understood the two truths that would inform everything to follow. That freeing him had altered the balance of the castle and the kingdom, and that the measure of what he would become would be written in the choices he made now, under the witness of her small, beating heart. Outside, distant and then nearer, the clamor of discovery began to unspool. A shout, the clack of armor, the bell that marked alarm. Dorian stood slowly, testing each joint as a man might test a blade, and looked at her with a clarity she had never seen. "Come," he said, voice steadied into a thing of promise. "We will answer what they have written about me with what we will write together." She had freed an immortal. She had also freed a companion. Whatever the cost, she had chosen to trade one kind of silence for another. The silence of chains, for the silence that can come between two people who have both chosen to change. As the first torches guttered through the stair, Ilara snatched the wool to her chest and let Dorian's hand close around hers. The air between them thrummed with danger and with a fragile, dangerous hope. The alarm came like a flint striking glass. A shout from above, a clang of metal, the sudden slam of the bell that tore through the castle's measured evening. It unspooled through corridors and kitchens, through rooms where lamps were trimmed and where noble feet scuffed with the casual certainty of privilege. Down below, where Ilara and Dorian had been learning the small grammar of one another, the sound folded into something that tasted of threat. Dorian rose as if from water. His movements were economical at first, a careful test of joints that had not borne free weight in 10 years. And then, as the blood remembered its old speed, he became something else entirely. The air around him tightened like drawn silk. Torches threw his shadow elongated and impossible across the stone. The chains lay on the floor, dull and useless. Where the metal had been, the skin gleamed in the candlelight with a color that was not only not human, but also not wholly inhuman. A filigree of moonlight threaded through skin. It was beautiful and terrible in the way a storm is beautiful and terrible. "Ilara," he said softly, the name a tether in the chaos. He did not snatch her up or rush. His hand found hers with a gravity that was respectful and immediate. "There is a passage I know. Come." He led, and she followed, heartbeat sinking to his calm, to the certainty in the way his stride negotiated stairs and ruined plans. The passage he chose was old, carved in the age before the current king's maps, a seam in the castle's underbelly that did not appear on any ledger. It smelled of damp and river silt and something like memory. They moved single file through narrowing stone, the cadence of their steps a soft percussion under the louder drum of the hunt above. Around them, Dorian's power spoke in small languages. A loose flagstone lifted itself like a blink to clear their way. A shaft of stale air reversed, as if someone breathed out after a long sleep. The silence carried with it a chorus of small, uncanny noises. A muffled echo that answered 3 notes to Dorian's 1. A dim glow that crept like phosphorescence along the mortar to mark a hidden seam. Each manifestation was unsettling to Ilara. A brush of fingers across the back of her neck. A proof that the world had more textures than the kitchen and the laundry. Yet she felt a fierce, dangerous exhilaration bloom under her ribs. They skirted old guardrooms where the banners had been put away after an earlier campaign. The ghosts of soldierly discipline hung in the air like old smoke. They paused where a shaft opened into a chamber once used to store the king's winter stores. A ghost of aroma, cloves, old wine rose and vanished. Dorian's ears twitched. His attention was a blade calibrated to the presence of others. He flattened them into niches with the silence of someone who had learned to hide not through cowardice, but through calculation. Footfalls reached them from further in the castle, the heavy boots of men answering the alarm. Voices carried, rough and certain, "Seal the wings! No one out!" The hunt had begun in earnest. Ilara's breath came fast. She felt small in range of the danger and large in the size of the choice she had made. A torch flared behind them, a guard making a turn faster than expected. Dorian moved before she could think. His motion was a blur long enough to displace air. He reached the man without touching him, and the guard stumbled as though some hand had pressed against his chest. He fell forward in a heap, breath leaving him in a surprised rasp, eyes wide with the quick correction of his world. Dorian's face had the faintest shadow of apology as he checked the man for life, then crouched and nudged him so that the man's body lay as though asleep in the path. "We do not need blood," Dorian murmured, an iron principle wrapped in velvet. "We need to pass." Ilara, who had never before seen a life taken or spared by such quiet violence, felt a tremor of something that might have been moral reckoning. She asked, barely a whisper, could you have not?" "I could have broken his arm," Dorian answered. "I could have broken his neck. I did not. I will not let the story that justified my chains become the story I live by." His gaze found hers in the dim, and she saw there the long view of someone who had watched empires erode like soft stone. "Do not mistake restraint for weakness." They moved on, using the keeper's old plan. The river runs deeper here. and there is a sluice that leads beyond the outer wall. The passage angled down and opened into a low cave where the sound of water became a presence in itself. Moonlight cut through a crack and painted the river in a strip of silver. The water smelled of moss and clean things. For a small, reckless second, Alara thought she could stand there and let the river's sound press all knowledge into smoothness. But voices again, nearer now, and a shout that carried a name she knew too well. Marek, the young guard's voice cut like a blade. The chase had teeth. Dorian glanced at her and then into the river. He waded in without hesitation, the water swallowing him to the waist. For all the terrors that clung to him, there was a practicality deeper still. He turned and held out his hand. "Take my arm," he said. "Trust me." She took it. The water was cold and it bit like truth. As they moved into the current, the castle behind them sent the sound of organized fury. A dozen men, torches bobbing like angry stars that grew and then receded as the sluice swallowed much of the noise. Alara clenched his hand until her knuckles whitened, and she felt in that grasp both fear and a surprising lightness, as if stepping into the river had stripped small weights from her. They moved through the water, and Dorian's presence seemed to dampen the harshness of the world. The current shifted with a kind of awareness, bearing them toward a tunnel that breathed with green and moon and the promise of something beyond stone. The chase pressed on in muffled, frustrated cadence. Boots pounded where they could and cursed where they could not. The last torch bobbed and then stuttered as the guards reached the sluice and found only empty water. When they emerged on the far bank beneath a clump of alder, the night opened wide and indifferent. Alara tasted freedom like cold metal and something softer, the first clean air she'd inhaled without having to count steps. Dorian stood on the bank, wet and luminous, and for a beat he looked like a man who had remembered how to stand. "You were frightened," he said simply, and there was no reproach in it. She laughed then, a sound that had both terror and exhilaration braided through it. "I am still frightened," she admitted, "but it is different." He moved closer, and she could feel his heat even in the river breeze. "Different is the name of things after they change," Dorian said. His fingers brushed the side of her face in a gesture that was careful as a benediction. "We are not safe, Alara. We are not quiet. But for the first time in a long while, we are writing our own story." She let his hand stay there, and in the press of night and alder and the river's slow music, she found the complicated comfort of having chosen danger for the sake of something true. The guards would return. The kingdom would tilt its balance and call for retribution. But at that moment, with wet hem and a heart that hammered like a small drum, Alara felt both terror and exhilaration as twin currents underfoot, and she stepped forward anyways, hands still nested in his. When the alder thinned and the land opened, the world breathed differently. The castle's stone became a silhouette behind them, a dark tooth in the horizon, and before Alara spread a country that no ledger had measured, a ribbon of moonlit meadow, a wood whose trees were older than the king's laws, and a sky so wide it seemed to have been left empty by design. The air tasted of moss and rain that had never fallen. It carried voices like leaves letting go. They walked without much thought to direction, only to distance from the torches and the men who answered the bell. Dorian moved with an economy she had begun to trust. He kept his senses tuned to the world in small, precise ways, as if listening for the soupçon of a footstep or the tilt of a branch. The moon lay full and fat above them, an old coin burnished bright. When its light spilled across Dorian's shoulders, he changed in the way the tide changes beneath a moon. Subtle, inexorable, powerful. There were things in this borderland the songs did not teach. The forest did not simply hold sound, it remembered it. Branches bent not to wind but to memory, and where they brushed one another it was like pages turning. Shadows there were layered, first the shadow of leaf on leaf, then the shadow of intention, then something older, like the memory of a dream. Alara felt them all like a language shifting at the edge of comprehension. Sometimes the air around them whispered a name and then denied it, like a shy thing ashamed to be known. Dorian's steps grew lighter in the wild. The loosened muscles he had tested in the river unlocked the way a key turns in a lock. Moonlight wrapped his skin in a silver that was not merely reflective, but alimentary. The light fed him in a way coal and bread never could. She watched as the small filigree of his veins seemed to drink the moon, as if the night itself threaded him with power. The sight unsettled and mesmerized her in equal measure. It was grotesquely beautiful, the way a winter branch could look like lace. It was evidence that he belonged as much to the dark as he did to whatever of the human remained. He noticed her watching. For a moment his face closed, an old caution returning like armor. "Do not stare as if I am a constellation," he murmured, half ironical, half solemn. "Stare too long, and you will learn the names of things that do not belong to you." Alara answered by stepping closer, not out of bravado, but because curiosity had become a kind of hunger. "Teach me one," she said. "Tell me one name." He hesitated, as if the forest itself had edged closer to listen. "There are names in the old tongue for things we are taught to forget," he said finally. "This wood is called Lyrian by some. It keeps pacts and remembers oaths. Men come through it and think themselves its masters. The trees keep the receipts." She smiled at the absurdity of trees keeping accounts. "Do they judge?" she asked. "They neither judge nor bless," Dorian replied. "They remember. That is more dangerous." His fingers brushed a low branch as they passed. The leaves trembled, whispering something like approval. "The realm we have stepped into is stitched with bargains older than kings. There are those who will not like an unbound thing moving through their bookkeeping." The notion that the world beyond the king's edicts ran on a different economy, oaths and memory rather than law and coin, made Alara's chest ache in a novel way. Her life had been measured by lists and chores. Here, measures were songs and promises. She wanted to ask him all the questions she had been hoarding. What did immortality feel like? Had he loved someone who'd lasted longer than a decade? Was he still capable of cruelty? But words gathered an edge she feared to sharpen. Instead, she reached for a safer ruin, the memory of the first time they had touched, his hand on her wrist as the chains fell away. It had been a small, steadying gesture, but now, under the wide, indifferent gaze of the stars, it felt like an unspoken covenant. She placed her palm against his forearm and felt warmth move across him like a tide. It was an answer and a plea at once. Dorian's reaction was immediate and complicated. He drew his hand back a fraction, as if measuring the consequence of staying close, then let it rest on her knuckles. His thumb made a slow circle, a private benediction. "There is a danger," he said quietly. "Not in the touch itself, but in what touch invites. I could take from you what you do not know you possess. I have been taught to see people as maps, places to be claimed, resources to be used. The king taught me to fear that in myself. You must know I will fight against it." Her laugh in reply was a small, incredulous thing. "You argue your own danger like a man bargaining with a mirror," she said. "And you, what do you fear most?" The knight folded his answer into its hem. "Becoming what they made me, an example and nothing more. Becoming a story used to frighten children into obedience." He breathed in, and the moonlight etched a silver line along his jaw. And his voice thinned. "Losing you. Not to death, not necessarily, but to whatever of me might consume what is bright in you. I have not been allowed the luxury of testing myself against tenderness." That confession landed like weather. Alara's hand tightened around his sleeve without meaning to. The idea that tenderness was a trial and not a refuge was the most human thing he had said. "Then let us test you," she whispered. "Slowly. With rules." He looked at her, a long, searching look that read bone and habit and surprise, and something like a smile trembled formlessly at his mouth. "Rules," he echoed, as if tasting the word. "Very well. Rule 1. No unnecessary blood." His voice betrayed a dry humor. "Rule 2. You name me honestly and I will do the same. Rule 3. When afraid, we speak the fear instead of letting it grow roots." She nodded, absurdly warmed by the mundane solidity of such edicts. "Rule 4, she said, thinking of the kitchen ledger of the counting out of days. "We do not become stories for others. We write for ourselves." Dorian's face, moon-carved and haunted, softened in acknowledgement, and then, almost without either of them planning it, the space between them contracted. The stars leant down, conspiratorial and cold. The Lyrian around them whispered like 1,000 careful witnesses. Dorian's fingers curled, and that same hand, which had gentled a chain and held a river's current, closed around the back of her neck. It was a touch that asked permission without asking. Alara's heart answered in a way that rearranged months of careful survival into a single, combustible beat. She leaned in until their foreheads touched, the small of his breath cool against her face, and the world reduced to the softs of night and the austere geometry of his cheek. For an instant the past and the future hung suspended between them, balanced on a decision no ledger could ever tally. Then, under the indifferent blaze of the moon and the woodland's thousand slow attestations, their lips met. First, a question, then a promise. It was not the fevered theft of youthful lust nor the practiced claim of a predator. It was more perilous. It was two flawed creatures testing a seam that, if mended, might hold for a long while. When they parted, the air tasted of earth and salt and the faint metallic tang that clung to Dorian when he had been near iron. He rested his forehead against hers and laughed quietly, a sound of astonishment and relief. "We will be complicated," he said. "So will the world," she answered. "But we have each other's names now." Around them, Lyrian rustled as if to applaud, and the distant castle bells chimed the hour they had left behind. They left the river with their clothes drying in the slow hand of the wind and the taste of mud on their tongues, thinking the night had been generous. The meadow only pretended at safety. In the wild, the world keeps its own calendars, and tonight one of those calendars had been opened. The column of torchlight that crawled across the far slope was not ordinary. It moved too with purpose, and at its head strode men in armor stamped with the king's crest, their faces set like hammered iron. Between them walked figures draped in midnight cloth whose hands traced patterns as they spoke. Sorcerers, the kind of power that turned fear into law. Dorian saw them first, because his hearing had been tuned by hunger and long waking. He halted with barely a sound, the motion of stopping a thing they had all come to accept as his preternatural calm. Alara felt the motion like a ledge sliding underfoot, the blood in her veins skittered to attention, an animal sensing a trap. "They've brought wizards," she whispered, and the word felt obscene, like naming a storm. "They brought what they were taught to rely on," Dorian replied. His voice was low and careful, an oar trying to find a channel. "They will try to make the world obey by making the unseen loud." The sorcerer's leader, a lean woman with an eye like a coin cut in half, lifted a hand and their scouts halted. She lifted her other palm, and the air around it shimmered with sigils, thin as spider silk and bright as ice. Her voice traveled like smoke. "Dorian of the Fallen Line," she called, and the name had the formal cruelty of a summons. "Return to your chains, and you will be granted mercy. Resist, and we will take what the king commands." Dorian's jaw twitched with something like amusement and something like contempt. "Mercy from those who bind truth into law is a hollow phrase," he said. The sorceress cut the air again. A rope of light flew toward them, braided runes singing with the intent to ensnare. It struck the grass and flared. Alara stepped forward before she thought. Not because she had a plan, but because her body knew the shape of protection as easily as it knew how to sweep floors. She planted herself between Dorian and the sorcerers, small and stubborn as a doorpost. "You will not touch him," she said. Her voice was not loud, but in the hush of the meadow it had the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. The leader's smile was the planet's rotation, slow and inevitable. "Child," she breathed, and the word was a dismissive wind. "You do not know what stands before you." The nearest sorcerer unfurled a sigil across the ground. It blazed blue-white and began to creep like frost toward Alara's boots. Dorian moved as if drawn by gravity, quick, precise, the motion of a thing constrained for so long and now remembering the exact torque of motion. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the rim of the sigil. The air around him bowed as if in deference, and the light dimmed to a gray uselessness. Around them, the soldiers shifted into a ring, spears angling like a field of sudden teeth. Men called out, authority hammered into slogans. One of them, young, perhaps freshly promoted, lobbed a bolt with a crossbow. The bolt hissed through the air, an ordinary violence, and found the bark of a tree a heartbeat before it could have found flesh. Dorian's attention flicked north, and the bolt's flight stuttered, as if some invisible hand had caught the string and let it go slack. It thudded uselessly into the trunk. The sorceress scowled and gestured. sending a spray of cold that turned the grass into frozen glass where it touched. The man at her side, an older practitioner with a face like folded maps, began a chant that made the air taste metallic. Runes shimmered up from the soil, coiling around Dorian like the fingers of a hand meant to hold him. Dorian moved with ancient economy. He did not strike, he did not scream. He shifted the pressure of his breath, and the shadows at his feet lengthened, not to swallow but to cushion. The coils of rune met the shadow and slackened as if the dark itself refused the leash. Soldiers who rushed in found their boots treading on slow, viscous darkness that only gripped to the extent the man walking on it allowed. Men slowed as their joints cooled, as if sleep is a polite thief who borrows strength rather than stealing it outright. Elara watched with a terror that mixed with a fierce pride. The power Dorian used was not the grotesque consumption the songs warned of. It was a careful reordering of insistence. He moved like someone corralling wild horses, gentle hands, impossibly strong restraint. But the sorcerers did not intend to be corralled. One of them redoubled his chant, and a spear of spectral ice lanced toward Dorian's chest. This time Dorian reacted like a man who understood consequence. He reached out, not to repel, but to redirect. The ice met his palm and bent. Instead of striking his body, it struck the ground and splintered into harmless frost that skinned the grass. The force of the blow folded on itself, and in the recoil knocked the sorcerer backwards as if the world had politely pushed him aside. The soldiers, baffled and unnerved, began to falter. Elara's courage cracked the arranged tension. She moved again toward Dorian, this time stepping in to take the sorcerer's attention in a manner that was reckless and deliberate. "You said mercy," she told the leader, voice steady. "We ask for it now. Hurt us if you must, but not in the way they taught you." The leader's eyes narrowed, and for a slow heartbeat it looked like she would answer in cruelty. Instead, she leaned forward and fixed Elara with a glance that measured fear and found it profitable. "Child," she said again, softer this time, "you are brave. Brave children make useful tailies." A blade of wind sliced the air where the sorceress's hand moved to complete a sealing gesture. The younger soldier lunged with his spear, but the shaft bent in his grip as if the world no longer supported such straightforward violence. Dorian moved to intercept, but Elara pushed at his arm and brought herself between them. A stray arc of magical ice grazed her cheek and cut, thin and burning, a ribbon of pain that bloomed white-hot and immediate. She tasted metal and something near sweet on her tongue. Dorian's eyes flared, not hungry but furious in the older, colder way of someone who knows what vengeance demands and what it costs. He could have unmade them, taken breath, blood, the slow measure of life. He drew in a breath instead, the soft sound of someone who climbs a steep place and chooses the harder path. He touched the ground with both palms, and the shadows rose like a tide, but not to drown. They wrapped around the soldier's feet, binding without breaking, snaring arms in woolly restraint, pressing faces toward the grass with a gentle pressure that made sleep inevitable rather than rupture. When the leader tried a final, desperate spell, Dorian met it with a low song that had no language but carried every necessary meaning. That he would not be made a spectacle, and that mercy could be harder than slaughter. The spell splintered against that song and fell like rain on stone. The hunters lay subdued and bewildered rather than slain. Men coughed and blinked, sorcerers muttered invocations that failed to stick, and the night stretched a weary sigh. Dorian put a hand to Elara's cheek, feeling the thin line of red, and his fingers trembled. "You could have been killed," he said, voice raw with a soft, terrible love. "You could have killed them," she answered, ignoring the pain. "And you didn't." He closed his eyes as if to fold the image of her into himself. Around them, the wood resumed its whispering. The soldiers, once conscious, scrambled to organize and shout, but their leader, the woman with the koinai, waved an order and they retreated, not with honor but with the bruised caution of those who had encountered something they did not understand. When the last torch bobbed out behind the ridge, a heavy silence settled. Elara sank to her knees, the cold under her pressing through her clothes, and let the adrenaline leak. Dorian knelt beside her and wrapped his cloak, his own, taken from the chain room in a hasty reach, across her shoulders like a benediction. "You bled for me," he said, each syllable a small, private accusation. She lifted her chin. "I chose to," she said, "and you chose not to become what they feared. That is why I stand." He pressed his forehead to hers, and for a moment the world narrowed to 2 breaths. They had won tonight in the narrowest of senses. The castle still breathed, hungry and patient. But something else had been broken, the illusion that the king's stories were uncontested. In their wake lay a track of small defiance, a mark the world would read if it cared. They were fugitives now, and perhaps prophets of another measure. For the first time, the stakes felt like a map they might trace together. The forest air was damp with dew, carrying the scent of moss and earth. Ilara's cloak clung to her shoulders, tattered from the flight, but her heart beat with a steadiness she had never known inside the castle walls. She sat across from Dorian, the faint glow of moonlight catching the angles of his face. He looked less like the monster whispered of in fearful halls, and more like a man carved from sorrow and memory. "You should not have chosen this path," he murmured, his voice low but edged with something that sounded like regret. "Your life could have remained untouched. You could have endured the castle's cruelty, but at least you would have lived." Ilara's lips curved in something between a laugh and a shiver. "Endured? You call that living? Scrubbing floors until my skin bled, bowing to those who never saw me. I was already dead to them, Dorian. At least now I breathe on my own terms." He looked at her then, fully, his eyes dark pools of centuries lived. They bore into her, searching for cracks for hesitation, but he found none. Instead, he found the fire of a girl who had lost everything and still dared to choose. "You remind me," he said after a silence, "of what I once fought for. When I was still human, before eternity was carved into my veins. There was a woman I loved, fierce, unyielding. She believed men could rise above their shadows. She believed I could." His jaw tightened. "But she was taken by those shadows. I failed her. I swore I would never let myself hope again." Ilara leaned closer, the rough bark of the tree pressing into her spine. "And yet, here you are speaking of her to me. Isn't that hope? Isn't that memory refusing to die?" His breath stilled. For a moment, she thought she had broken something sacred, but then he released a low, almost human laugh. It was brief, brittle, but real. "You risk much, Ilara, to free me, to speak to me as though I am not the curse they say I am." Her voice softened, almost breaking. "Because I see the curse in myself, loneliness, emptiness, a hunger for more than walls and cruelty. If that makes us both cursed, then at least we are cursed together." He reached for her hand, not fully, but his fingers brushed against hers, a fleeting contact like the whisper of wind through leaves. The touch carried the weight of 10 years of chains and centuries of exile, yet it was lighter than air. In that fragile moment, Ilara understood what she had chosen. Not safety, not survival. She had chosen the truth of him, the immortal bound in sorrow, the man beneath the myth. And he, in turn, had chosen to believe in her resolve, even as the world branded them traitors. The night pressed close around them, the forest holding their secret, while above, the stars burned as though they alone witnessed the beginning of something neither mortal nor eternal could undo. The throne room smelled of smoke and iron, the banners of the king swaying in the cold draft that cut through the cracks of the ancient stone. The air was tense, alive with the tremor of something greater than men. Dorian stepped into the hall, the shadows clinging to his form like armor, every movement echoing with the weight of centuries. His chains were gone, but the scars they had left glimmered faintly under torchlight, reminders of the decades stolen from him. The king sat high upon his throne, his jeweled crown catching the dim firelight. His court filled the chamber, knights with blades drawn, sorcerers whispering incantations, courtiers clutching pearls and prayers. Their eyes widened as Dorian appeared, but the king's gaze was steady, hard with the arrogance of a man who believed the world still bent to his will. "So the beast has slipped its leash," the king said, his voice sharp as steel. "I should have burned you to ash instead of burying you." Dorian's voice was low, thunder rolling beneath calm waters. "You did not bury me, you bound me, you stole years from me, and for what? Fear that your people might see you as small beside me." The king rose, his robes heavy, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword as if the weight of it alone could hold power. "I bound you because I am king. because no immortal shall rule over the realm of men. You are a curse, Dorian, a shadow. I will end you here before all who watch." The torches sputtered. The chamber darkened, and then the duel began. With a sweep of his hand, the king's sorcerers called forth walls of fire, sigils flaring in the air. But Dorian moved through the flames as if they were smoke, his eyes burning red with fury. Shadows leapt from his body, whirling into tendrils that struck like whips, flinging armored knights into stone walls. Swords clattered, screams echoed, but Dorian was relentless, a storm unchained. The king drew his blade, the steel glowing faintly as runes carved by priests flared to life. He charged, striking with speed unnatural for a mortal. Steel met shadow, light clashing with darkness in a violent burst that shook the chamber. Sparks rained, stone cracked, and the court cowered in terror. Dorian's voice boomed, rage consuming him. 10 years in chains, 10 years in silence, and now you dare speak of curses? You are the curse, king of men. His shadows tightened, coiling around the throne like serpents, crushing wood to splinters. The king struggled against them, his blade carving streaks of light, but his strength faltered. Dorian raised his hand, shadows sharpening into spears aimed for the king's chest. And then a voice cut through the roar. "Dorian!" Alara. She stumbled into the hall, her face pale, her body trembling with the weight of her choice. She had followed him here, though the path was death. Every eye turned to her, but she saw only him, Dorian, the man she had freed, now standing on the edge of becoming the monster they all feared. "Don't!" she cried, rushing forward, her steps echoing against stone. "If you kill him like this, you lose yourself. You become the thing they say you are." Dorian's hand trembled, shadows quivering like beasts held on a leash. His eyes, crimson with fury, flickered toward her. For a heartbeat, humanity wavered inside them, fragile as glass. "He deserves this," Dorian whispered, his voice raw. "He took everything. He took my years, my life, my—" "He doesn't deserve you," Alara said, tears glistening. "Not your soul. Not the man who listened to me when I had nothing, who saw me when the world turned away. Don't let him take that too." The king, seeing her distraction, lunged. His blade arced toward Dorian's chest. Without thought, Alara threw herself between them. The sword pierced her side, a cry tearing from her lips as blood spilled warm against stone. Time froze. Dorian caught her as she fell, the shadows collapsing into mist around them. Her blood stained his hands, his chest, his lips as he bent close, panic breaking through centuries of control. "Alara," his voice was no longer thunder but desperation. "No, no, stay with me. You can't." Her hand pressed weakly against his cheek, her eyes finding his with a fragile smile. "I told you we are cursed together, but even curses can feel like freedom." The king staggered back, stunned, but before he could strike again, Dorian's fury returned, not as blind vengeance, but as something sharp and clear. He rose, holding Alara close, his shadows unfurling once more, but this time they carried not hatred, but purpose. The shadows swept through the hall, tearing the king's sword from his hand, shattering the runes etched in its steel. The sorcerers fell silent, their spells ripped apart by the force of his will. Dorian advanced, his eyes fixed on the king. "You sought to make me a monster," Dorian said, his voice quiet now, dangerous in its stillness. "But she has shown me what even eternity could not teach. That vengeance is another chain, and I will not wear it." He stopped before the king, who trembled now, stripped of his power, his crown askew. Dorian leaned close, his voice like a whisper of the grave. "Your reign ends not by my hand, but by your fear. Live with it." The shadows receded, leaving the king kneeling, broken but alive. The court watched in stunned silence as Dorian turned away, cradling Alara against him. Her breath was shallow, her body trembling with pain. He held her as though his eternity meant nothing compared to the fragile weight of her mortal life. "You anchored me," he whispered against her hair. "When I would have lost myself, you bound me to what matters. I cannot let you go." Her lips moved, barely sound. "Then don't." And though the hall was still heavy with the echoes of battle, though the crown of the king lay crooked in the dust, there was only them, an immortal and a servant girl, bound not by chains or curses, but by sacrifice, by love, by the fragile thread of humanity that her blood had stitched back into his heart. The throne room lay in ruins, the air thick with smoke and dust. Shattered stone littered the floor, torn banners hung like ghosts, and the courtiers had fled into the night. The silence that followed the storm of battle was heavier than the clash of swords had been, as though the castle itself held its breath. The king knelt amid the wreckage, stripped of his crown, his pride shattered. His eyes, once blazing with command, were clouded with terror. He waited for death, but none came. Dorian stood over him, Alara's weight still in his arms, her blood staining his skin. The shadows that had once threatened to consume the hall now coiled quietly at his feet, no longer beasts of vengeance, but extensions of his will. "You will live," Dorian said, his voice low and final. "Not because you deserve mercy, but because she has taught me I am not what you made me. Rule in your fear. Know that your power ends where mine begins." The king bowed his head, broken. Dorian turned away, carrying Alara into the cold air of dawn. The night sky was fading, a thin light spreading across the horizon, soft and pale against the ruins. She stirred weakly in his arms, her eyes fluttering open. Pain etched her features, but when she looked at him, she smiled faintly. "You didn't kill him," she whispered. "No," Dorian said, kneeling to lay her gently upon the grass. "Because of you. Because you showed me the man I still might be." His voice faltered, and he bent close, pressing his forehead against hers. "You bled for me, Alara, for a creature the world calls a monster. I will spend every moment of eternity proving they were wrong." She reached for his hand, her touch fragile but steady. "Then eternity doesn't seem so frightening." The first light of morning touched them, soft and golden, casting the world in fragile hope. The castle behind them smoldered, its throne room scarred, its king humbled. But here, among the ashes, something new had been born: unity, fragile yet unbreakable. Alara, scarred but alive. Dorian, redeemed by her sacrifice. Together, they stood not as prisoner and servant, but as two souls bound by love and the promise of a future rebuilt from ruin. The forest was quiet in the wake of ruin, its branches heavy with dew, its silence broken only by the faint rustle of leaves beneath their steps. Dorian walked at Alara's side, his arms steady around her, every movement cautious so as not to deepen the wound that still ached beneath her ribs. She leaned into him, not out of weakness, but with the unspoken trust of one who had chosen this path without regret. Behind them, the castle loomed in the distance, its towers black against the paling night. Smoke trailed faintly from the shattered throne room, a reminder of the battle they had survived. Yet neither looked back. Whatever that place had been, prison, home, kingdom, it was no longer theirs. Their world lay ahead, not behind. The earth smelled of damp soil and pine, a scent that felt like freedom. Alara drew in a breath, steadying herself, her fingers curling tighter around his hand. "It feels strange," she said softly, her voice carrying in the stillness. "For so long, the castle was all I knew. Every stone, every shadow, it was a cage. And now, with nothing certain ahead, I've never felt more alive." Dorian's gaze lingered on her, the pale light of dawn softening the sharp lines of his immortal face. "You've given me something I thought lost forever," he murmured. "Choice, the chance to walk beside someone who does not see chains or curses but a man. Whatever lies ahead, it will be ours." They followed the winding path into the woods, their steps slow but resolute. Shadows clung to the forest floor, yet between them beams of light broke through, threads of gold weaving with the darkness. Alara noticed, and a faint smile touched her lips. "Light and shadow," she whispered. "They don't fight here. They exist together." Dorian squeezed her hand gently, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps that is what we are, not one against the other, but two halves of something whole." The horizon began to brighten, a faint blush of rose and gold spreading over the trees. The birds stirred, their calls timid at first, then braver as if the world itself dared to believe in renewal. Alara tilted her head toward the sky, her heart aching with hope and fear entwined. "We don't know what waits beyond these woods. Hunters may follow, the king may rise again. And yet," she turned to him, her eyes unwavering, "I would not trade this for anything." He stopped for a moment, pulling her closer, his arm firm around her waist as though grounding himself in her presence. "Nor would I, whatever trials come, I swear to face them not as shadow alone, but with you. You are my anchor, Alara, my beginning, even after centuries of endings. As they stepped forward again, the first rays of sunrise spilled over the horizon, painting the dark woods in hues of fire and gold. Light and shadow wove together, indistinguishable, inseparable. And there, beneath the dawning sky, they walked hand in hand, into uncertainty, into danger, into hope. A new path, carved not by fate or kings, but by the choices they had made together.